Hi, everyone. Welcome to your lecture on sensory and perceptual development. Hopefully, this guys will give you a little bit more insight. And if you have any questions, please shoot me an email. So, with that being said, part of our guiding questions to start our lecture is we're going to start looking at kind of visual to begin with. But why is it important to understand visual development, or what's the importance of understanding visual development, especially in our K-12 students that we're teaching physical activity to? And part of that reason does have to do with the fact that vision plays a major role in most of our skill performance. So, to get started, we need to talk about the difference between sensation and perception. So, sensation is the neural activity triggered by stimulation of a sensory receptor. So, basically, it's just neural activity. So, you stimulate a receptor in the body, and it sends this neural activity to your brain to look at sensation. Um, Sensory nerve impulses travel through sensory nerves to the brain. And so sensory is just that feeling. So it's an input kind of thing, and sensory sensation is just about this happens and this is how we feel it. So that's the sensations that we get from being touched or uh, encountering something warm. Perception, on the other hand, is a multi stage process with the central nervous system. The perception is going to include the selection of certain information, the processing, the organization of that information, and integrating that from what we receive from our senses. And so, what really happens is sensation is just the general what's happening. You're being touched, or you feel something warm, or you feel like you're moving an object in space. And perception allows you to be able to take those different sensory inputs and put them together to kind of put a picture of what's actually going on. So our perception of what we think is going on. And so part of the reason we talk about the difference between this is an identical sensation can yield different perceptions depending on what's going on. And a good example of this is like a haunted house. So if I was to drag a rope across your face, or you were to walk into a rope hanging from the ceiling with the daylight on, and you can see what it is, what you perceive is just a rope across your face. However, in a haunted house where the lights are more dim, maybe it's dark, there's other noises going on, and that rope comes across your face hanging from the ceiling, you may interpret that as something much different and think that that is something trying to harm you, and you get this little scare. And so that's kind of the difference between perception and sensation. So a good example of this is if you look at this picture, um, the sensation, the visual stimulus that we're giving is the same, but your perception of this could be different. Some of you are going to look at this and immediately see a vase, and then others of you are going to see two faces staring at each other. If you focus more on the white, you'll probably see that vase. If you focus more on the black, you'll see the two faces staring at each other. And again, a good example of that sensation versus perception. So our sensory systems, these are the things that we sense. We get the input from, and then our brain will interpret for perception. Um, they are individualistic. These systems function kind of on their own, and so typically you're looking at things like visual, kinesthetic, so the touching, feeling, and then auditory senses. So think about your senses in that way. And so one thing to look at is how might sensory disability. So if you struggle in one of these areas, how might that limit your development, or what skills may become harder for you because these senses are off. And it could even be a particular sport as well, and how modifications might have to occur. So let's start with visual development. So visual development and sensation. When we talk about this, infants have functionally useful vision. So at birth, for the most part, a normal infant is going to be able to see. They're going to have functional vision. They're going to be getting images and starting to process those. Um, by about 6 months of age, that vision is adequate for determining locomotion through the environment or being able to move through the environment. Because initially, again, you're getting all these new images as an infant, and the brain's trying to process. And so it takes a little while to kind of build that perception off of the sensations it's getting. So part of our vision is our acuity. And so acuity is just simply the sharpness of our sight. So how well we can see things. Are they blurry, or are we able to depict and fully see the resolution of they are? So think of a blurry image versus when it's nice and crisp and clear. So in the first month, acuity is what's called 20 to 400. So if you're used to that normal kind of 20/20 scale is what you think about as normal, perfect vision. 20 to 400 that an infant has in the first month is about 5% of the normal adult level. So the acuity is not very good. They can see shapes and things like that. But infants can differentiate features at like 20 inches away from their face, but things become much blurrier further back or closer in because the muscles that control the focus of the eye are learning to work and communicate with the brain and things like that. So that visual acuity sharpens as they get to the age of 5, and we're around 20 to they're around have a vision of about 20/30 by the age of 5, and then usually by about the age of 10, most students will have a visual acuity of 20/20 by about that age 10. But again, there are vision impairments much younger than that, and so that is one thing. This is on the average. So when you're measuring visual acuity, you guys have probably done this test before. It often involves reading big block letters where the size and the space between the letters is manipulated. So you start with that big E on the top, and then you get further back, and each row gets the letters get smaller, and the spacing between the letters gets closer. And so the more you can tell those apart, the better your acuity is. And so usually those results are expressed on what's called the Snellen scale, which is 20/20 vision, requires no correction from eyeglasses or something like that. And so that is the way you typically look for visual acuity, and that'll usually happen a lot of times in the K5, the kind of the primary school level, and younger kids because it's harder. Usually, it's not something that's noticed as much, and so you kind of look at it uh, sometimes in your health and physical education classes just to see if that's going to be an issue. So, visual changes with age. Most of you may understand that typically vision declines as you get older, and this can have implication on skill performance and even everyday tasks. A lot of times, you'll see that most older adults tend to wear glasses or need to wear glasses, maybe even when they read. And so, there's a condition called presbyopia. I'm not exactly great on the pronunciation, but it affects our ability to see nearby objects. And so this would be when someone takes out readers that basically magnifies the image so they can see it a little bit more clearly. In most, that's pretty typical in vision as we get older. You need something to help correct those nearby objects. Um, and additionally, as you age, you may realize that more light is needed. Again, you'll see older adults needing more light to read or trying to pull lamps aside or various things to increase that light and it being harder. And so all of this kind of goes with it. And so it's just an idea to keep in mind as you're looking through the age span. So there are things that you can look for symptoms of visual problems when you're working with students or older adults or anyone. And this is across any age. And so part of this could be the lack of hand-eye coordination. So there are other things in younger kids that could be signified by hand-eye coordination, but vision problems can definitely be one of them, especially when it comes to using striking implements. If they're trying to squint to see certain things, like a ball's coming at them and they're trying to squint to see it, that could be a sign. Under or overreaching for an object, so there's an object sitting there and their hand goes past it or falls a little short, and they can be very subtle and quickly corrected if they've been doing it a while. And then also unusual head movements, maybe trying to adjust to see not quite getting that sensory input correctly for that perception to be molded correctly. So when we talk about visual perception and perceiving things, there are a lot of things that go into our perception that involves our vision. And so this is the space that we're in and the space around the objects themselves, what they look like, how they're shaped, the contrast with them, and whether or not they're moving. So most of the time, if something is moving, we can't pick up as much detail, but we may gather some different information with an object moving versus an object that is sitting still. So our perception of space, this requires, when we're looking at the space, for us to be able to perceive objects and maybe their size, we have to know kind of depth and be able to look at the distance something is away and estimate those types of things, and having reference objects. So when you look up in the sky, if we put an object in the sky and you're just looking at it, it may look really big or really small relative to what you would expect it to be, because there are very few things in the sky that allow us to judge accurate depth and distance, and just size ratios when it comes to that. And so that's part of it. And so we're looking for all kinds of things that can come in and help us learn about the space. So retinal disparity, so how our retina is looking at it. Also, motion in with that. So if it's moving across something, we can start to gauge that size and how much our eyes are actually having to move to follow an object. And so think about some of the things that in our daily lives require this perception of space, or sports or dance activities that require this space. There are lots of them. So daily activity, driving is always a good one when you're looking at that. And our sports, many of our sports are going to require that perception of space, like throwing a ball to a certain place. We have to know about how far away it is to be able to give the correct amount of force. So that perception of object, so we're trying to give an object attributions of size and shape and motion. And so we tend to pick these particular things up based on the edges. So the outside edges of our object um, tends to be when we're looking at an object, we either classify them as boundaries or non-boundaries. Boundaries are assigned to objects. So basically we can see the edge of it and it gives a boundary to a ball. So you can see that circular shape. And based on the contrast and its positioning in space that we talked about before, that's going to help us to determine the size and whether it's moving. If the boundaries or the edges are a little bit blurred, we tend to associate that with movement. And that's done in pictures as well. Still pictures, if you blur them a little bit, people tend to think they're moving, and that goes to our perception and our visual sense. So here's an example of one way we can kind of look at heart versus part versus whole perception in the mind. When you look at this, you should kind of see the pumpkin or a jack-o'-lantern, but when you really break it down and you look more acutely, you should see the eyes are made of oranges, the nose of strawberries, the mouth is a banana, so things like that. So as we move forward, we kind of have a basis of this vision, and so that works on its own. But in activity, we also pair more of these senses. So vision has its own perception, but we also have perception of motion, which goes into this, and then they stack upon each other. And so um, there are some neurological mechanisms that are helping us to that are dedicated to detecting motion. So infants perceive motion very easily. Anything that's moving, they kind of are attracted to. You know this by those mobiles or whatever that's above them, or they follow anything that's moving at a young age. Um, Perception of direction and velocity of motion improves during infancy. So being able to look, kind of know which direction they're heading and be able to look ahead, and also how fast my head should move to keep up with them. All those pick up in infancy quite well. So with that, we do have some development of this kinesthetic or movement sensation. So kinesthetics are movement, and also more than movement, it's about how we're moving through time and space, along with other things that are possibly moving through time and space that are connected to our vision. So we have proprioceptors that kind of give us an idea of where our body is in space and how we're moving through that. And so there's two things that go along with this. We have somatosensors, which are kind of that telling us where we're at in space, and then our vestibular apparatus tells us it's kind of our balance. It's representing how we're aligned in the space that we're in. So where my limbs are would be kind of somatosensor, where they're pointed, how they're moving. Vestibular apparatus is my orientation to the space around me. So what direction things are coming from, maybe where I'm moving, the balance with that as well, and in comparison to gravity. Okay, so with kinesthetics in infancy, the receptors probably function prenatally, so they actually start working before you're actually born. But kinesthetics are definitely there once you are born fully, because early on you respond to touch. Very early on, kids know the newborns know when they're being touched, especially in the facial area, and so this is really good for them. So think about why that could be important. And so the vestibular part of this, so more of the balance and where we are at in space, starts to take function around the age of 2 months, if not earlier. So there is a little bit of lag there, but again, we're trying to get used to it. It's they've kind of been suspended in fluid for 9 months, and so it takes a little while for the brain to interpret those vestibular systems. So with our kinesthetic perception, um, there are a lot of different elements that go into that, and so it's with kinesthetic, is a single touch? Are there multiple touch points that are going on that we're trying to interpret? Is there an object involved? Is our body involved in this? And how much of our body? Are our limbs moving? And then also our spatial orientation and direction, which way we're moving. So these are there's a lot of things here, but you can see how they're all slightly related. If we're not using an object and we're doing things sitting on the ground and we're not moving limbs, our movement and our perception of these are going to be a little bit different. And you can see as it gets more complex, it usually takes us into an older age to be able to fully comprehend those and utilize them in movement. So when it comes to tactile location, so newborns can feel touches. For what activity? So newborns can feel touches, like that's there. And so the question here, and it kind of relates back, is we talked about how they could feel touches on their face. What activity in the first few hours of birth is perception of touch really important? Well, it actually comes to feeding, right? You have to, when something is touching my face, especially around my mouth, I know to open my mouth to be able to get food. And so that's part of what goes into this newborns can feel touches, and it's really good. Um, our perception of touch location improves in early childhood. So as they're getting older and older, we tend to not just say, "Ooh, they're touching me," so maybe I just open my mouth, which happens in newborns. They start to realize where the touch is. Is it on my leg? Is it on my hand? And they want me to grasp something instead of just on my arm where my hand is closed automatically. If they're touching my face, is it near my mouth or is it at the top of my head? And so we also tend to start being able to gain threshold, or we start to easily more recognize as we get older to be able to discriminate the difference between one touch and two nearby touches. So, in a newborn infant, you can touch them, and you can be kind of far apart, and you get this. They don't know the difference. They feel it as one touch. Their somatosensors haven't been able to fully put together that touch here on the top of my hand versus the bottom of my hand is a little bit different. As we get older, we tend to be able to differentiate those a little bit better. So, as we get more in tune with those, we start to have more body awareness, and so we can start identifying body parts. Children are able to, as they get older, kind of label their parts more: arms and legs and feet and hands. And they start knowing their dimensions, like how much room they take up. Can I fit through this particular space? And so part of that is children master up and down body movement and how they are in space. So they're up and down, standing up, sitting down first. Then they kind of get front and backwards movement and how they move in space. And then at the end of it, they get side to side movement. And so that's really important when we think about that progression in a child or any adult or any new activity, how we're probably going to pick those up first. Up and down, front to back, and then side to side tends to be the most difficult, even for adults, for a new activity. And so laterally, knowing sides of the body are distinct is part of this. So children show adult-like responses by about 10 years of old, being able to go side to side, and the differences between those. They start more being able to label left and right as well. And so this helps in that if you know which direction you're moving in left and right. So we also have to talk about, with body awareness, lateral dominance. So most of us prefer one eye or one ear or one hand or one foot over another. Infants show preference early on. Handedness, so right-handed, left-handed, kind of going right, or how we do things, is usually established around by the age of 4 years old. And there's no evidence that shows that pure dominance is necessary, so that we have to be either one right-handed or left-handed. It's not proven that that's any more beneficial than being able to kind of use both. But you definitely don't want to, and this was something that was done a number of years ago, but was definitely detrimental to people, was forcing people to have to only use one side or one dominance. And so this was seen in kids that were left-handed. For whatever reason, it was seen as not good. And so parents would force their kids to use their right hand for everything, because the world is kind of designed for right-handed people. So they would force them. That can cause some developmental delays and issues over time. And so we want to refrain from that, but we don't have to force a pure dominance if they always have to use their right hand, especially early on. So with that laterality, children with developmental delays often struggle to cross the midline of the body with hands and arms to complete a task on opposite sides. And so that's one way to kind of look to see, are they having some trouble, to identify that. Are they having trouble doing something and moving it over across the midline of the body? So if you're looking at them, you separate left and right. Can what I'm doing in my right hand, I need to move it over to the left, can that be done? And so try to think about a motor or daily task that requires you to cross the midline of the body at school or things like that. So one simple example would be if you're doing the little block thing, you've got to put pieces in the right hole. You got a square, it goes in the square, a circle that goes into the circle. Kid has the square in his right hand, and the square hole is on the left side of his body. Is he able to move his hand over and drop that block there? Or he has trouble doing that, and so he moves that block into his left hand to put it over there, not because of a reach issue, because he can't really manipulate the object to go in. And so this would be a more complex task that could show that. And so think about some other ideas with that may cause that, may have difficulty crossing that midline. So in addition to that includes our limb movement. Part of what we learn to do, especially in activity, but really across life, is to be able to reproduce a limb movement over and over again and relocate a limb position. So get my limb and my arm or leg in the same position it was in. We tend to do this, and we get better at it as we go into late childhood. So you're doing this even if you're not, being physically active or thinking like running or sports. You reproduce a limb movement every time you write. You're reproducing how you make an E or an A every single time, and that's why you do it over and over again. You try to get where you can reproduce it the same way and start in the same position, and you tend to hold your pencil in the same way every single time. And so our perception of limb movement improves in late childhood, and we get better at it. And so the pinnacle of this limb movement and the perception of reproducing a limb movement that's really good is when you've done an activity for so long, you kind of know the result before it happens. So you'll see this with golf swings, you'll see this in basketball shots, where as soon as they swing the club, or as soon as they swing a bat and they hit the ball, or as soon as they let a shot go off their fingertips, they're like, ooh, that was good or that was bad. That comes to that limb movement and knowing how we move through space, and that reproducing of it of that was good and that wasn't. And so I know whether that was good or bad before I see the end result. So additionally, with our spatial orientation and direction as part of this kinesthetic kind of sensory input and perception, our directionality improves in childhood, what direction we're moving or need to move into. And also we get better at transposing right and left as we move into adolescence, so even older, so as we move into teenage years. And so this is where, if I can do something with my right hand, can I be able to do that with my left hand, right? If I can kick with my right foot this way, can I interpret how I should do that to be able to do that with my left foot of the same interior? And so that takes a lot of perception and mental calculation to be able to transpose something to get the same result using both left and right. So that moves us into the last sensory system that we'll talk about today, which is our auditory development. So we've got kinesthetics, we had visual, think about those preparing in, and then we have auditory, which is its own sensation, has its own perceptions, and then putting these three together kind of gives us that full picture. And again, missing any one of these could be detrimental to our motor development. So there are three structures that are involved with hearing. You've got your external ear, you've got the middle of your ear, and then the very inner ear, the control of the inner ear is really helping with this auditory sensation. And so all of these are important because our external ear can actually, if your external ear is damaged, it can actually make it where it's harder to hear, because your ears are designed to capture sound and funnel them into the middle ear. If the middle ear is damaged, if the structure is not right, it may not transfer into the control of the inner ear, which eventually takes these sound vibrations and turns them into interpretable sounds like what you're hearing right now. So audition. It's a weird. So your auditory senses in infancy. So infants, their threshold for sound. So what it takes for them to recognize that a sound is occurring is really high. So infants, it takes a louder sound to kind of grab their attention than it does in you and I. However, that being said, it's not so high that they can't detect the normal speaking voice, but it takes more. They're not going to respond to a sound that is as quiet as something you and I could recognize and respond to, especially in certain frequencies. Um, there is a lot of rapid movement and improvement in the first few weeks. Again, they were sitting in a fluid sac, literally in the womb, and so coming out, all those things are a little bit interrupted in trying to interpret those. The brain's working that out. But after about 3 months, infants start to hear low frequency sounds well. So really low bass sounds they're not so good at initial birth. After about 3 months, everything starts to settle. Their brain gets used to it, and so they start to hear low frequencies a little bit better. And so as they age, or as we age, our hearing tends to pick up a little bit. We get a little bit more acute sound. Uh, pick, we can hear more acute things. We can hear a wider range of frequencies after a few months, and then we learn to interpret those. As we get older, we tend to have hearing loss, and so it tends to happen more frequently in adults. We see more cases of it. So there is a certain level where it's called pre-psychus, is how I think it's pronounced, in older adults, and so this is hearing loss. But even if we don't have it diagnosed, there is some hearing loss that occurs as you naturally get older. We lose some of the extremes of the human frequency hearing first. So the really low lows and the really high highs kind of go, even if you don't really have much going on. And so there's maybe some physiological source to that as well. So there's a thing called a mosquito tone that you can look up. You may have heard it before. It's this really high pitched sound that adolescents, teens, anyone really younger than the age of about 20 can for sure hear, unless they have some auditory challenges. And then as you start to move into your 20s, mid 20s, at some point you kind of lose that. Pretty much everyone in their 30s can't really hear that sound. There are a few people, but most people can't hear that sound once they hit 30. Most people, it's even younger than that. Somewhere in their 20s, they lose hearing that. So you can go look at mosquito sound. It's really high pitched. Your dogs will always be able to hear it, but you may be playing it and be like, I can't hear anything. And someone younger comes in the room and be like, oh, that's really loud. And so that's an example of that. And that could have some of that physiological source. We do know that a lot of hearing loss, though, also comes from lifelong exposure. This could be from environmental noise, so maybe you work in a loud factory. It could be from your own choosing, lots of loud concerts, or you worked at concerts all the time, or possibly put headphones in and listened to it way too loud, listen to music in your car too loud, or uh, people in the military tend to have this as well from the explosions of gunshots and things like that. Um, so that is one thing to consider. We do have to also think about generally when it comes to hearing, even if we don't have any issues and there are no hearing losses, our thresholds tend to change. So being able to differentiate between sounds and also how much sound it takes to kind of grab our attention tends to increase as we get older. And so again, think about talking to someone older. You tend to have to talk a little bit louder, almost yell at them sometimes to get their attention. That threshold for that auditory sense to reach through the neural pathway is increased, kind of like with an infant. Um, Also, it tends to be as we get older, hearing in noisy backgrounds is more difficult. Kids, you can have a billion sounds going on, and they can have a direct conversation with you and be able to hear what you're saying. And older adults, if there's a lot of noise in the background, or even just minimal noise in the background, they may not be able to distinguish or differentiate between your speech and the things in the background. So, those are good notes to always keep in mind. Um, so your auditory perception involves being able to determine the location that a noise is coming from, the differences in similar sounds. So they can be very similar, but are there differences in them? Are there patterns to the sound? And then um, the auditory figure in ground. So where is it coming from? Like kind of where it's at in space, not just the location, but that auditory figure in sound. So, but the location, newborns are really good at this. Newborns turn to the direction of the sound. Um, by the age of 3, you can start picking up more distant sounds and be able to locate them. Um, there's not a ton of things that are known about the perception of distance in sound with infants. They can't really communicate to pick that up. But we do know that as we get older, if we have some of this hearing loss, it can be more difficult to locate sounds. So older adults can't find the phone that's ringing. A young kid can very distinctly figure out where that sound's coming from. Older adults may have that trouble because of being able to distinguish the sound on the threshold. So some differences always to note is that infants can discriminate basic speech sounds from at 1 to 4 months of age. So they really quickly can start discriminating basic speech. As they get older, they can discriminate better and start to form words, and that's how this process works of communication. Older adults, speech perception, due to the decrease in the sensitivity and the tones that we talk at, can make it harder to differentiate that. And so that's one thing to always note when it comes to picking up differences in sound. Older adults may need to talk in a certain register, so you may have to increase to a higher pitch or go lower for them to be able to detect that. Where kids tend to, after they get a little ways, can pick up anyone's speech. And so those are things to note, but also places to look for differentiations, or if someone has auditory disadvantages or has issues with their auditory system, is maybe they have trouble distinguishing one voice from another, or can hear one person really good and not the other. Well, what's the difference there? So with that, you can kind of see all the different systems that are here, how they're going through the aging process. And so really kind of putting those pieces together on why it's important, and those changes, and then how those relate together. That each of these systems is independent and has their own things to look for, but they also all come together in our movement and sport, and really throughout life, but definitely as we look at it in movement and sport, and how you can change things or adapt things to make that easier for a child or difficult for a child, or help them improve those skills, right? And so it's always things to consider, especially if you're having a child that's having trouble listening to you or not following directions. Could it be something in their auditory system or visual system? So that kind of finishes our lecture. If you have any questions, please let me know. And I hope you guys learned something and enjoyed that lecture.